afternoon, participants. We now have Mr. Shashank Karnad from Mahajan and Aibara. He is the partner and CEO for forensic services with Mahajan and Aibara, who are our gold sponsors for today. The topic of today's discussion of Shashank is future of fraud in a digital economy. So with this, I would like to, share an introduction of Shashank. He's a chartered accountant with over 25 years of post-qualification experience in cyber investigations, financial fraud investigations, dispute advisory services, internal audit, corporate governance, and fraud risk management. Shashank has worked with KPMG for about 18 years in multiple international offices and was a partner and COO in KPMG's forensic practice based out of Mumbai. Thereafter, he was with Protivity and FTI Consulting as Managing Director and Senior Managing Director in their forensic practices. At KPMG, Shashank led the consumer markets, FMCG and consumer durable sector for the risk consulting practice between 2011 and 14, and in the infrastructure sector for forensic between 2014 and 17. Shashank has been recognized as a global leader by Who's Who Legal, a global research organization in the forensic accountant category, consequently for the years 2020 and 2021. So without further ado, let me now ask Shashank to share his thoughts on future of fraud in digital economy. Thank you. Over to you, Shashank.
Thank you very much, Percy. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining in. I'm sure the introductory talk was very inspiring and very topical. So therefore, I think it's a good segue for me to talk about my subject as well, which is the future of fraud in a digital economy. We've all heard in the recent past what the world has been doing. Of course, dealing with the pandemic is one aspect, but also in parallel, we've been trying our best to go digital. Companies are going digital, people are working from home, and the amount of expenditure that is happening in digitizing everything and to reduce manual involvement. Lots and lots of dollars and lots of rupees are getting spent in doing that. Alongside that, it's the new normal, is a phrase I'm sure all of you would have heard. And in this new normal, we need to understand what kind of risks we are exposed to. And all of us have some role with regard to risk management. And fraud is an element of risk management. And the focus, therefore, for me is to look at what new challenges, what new risks that we might be exposed to as a consequence of this new wave of digitization that is sweeping the world. And therefore, my session today is going to talk about precisely that. Over the next 30 or so minutes, while my allocated time slot is about 45 minutes, over the next 30 or so minutes, I'll be covering my technical or content presentation, and I will leave about 10 or 15 minutes in the end for question and answers. So this is broadly the one that I'm going to cover, the topics which I hope to cover over the next 30 odd minutes. This image that you all see before you is one of an iceberg. And like the proverbial saying goes, you can only see the tip of the iceberg. And that's true for even normal conventional frauds, where in organizations, if you look at the typical, expense report fraud or procurement fraud or accounting fraud, you probably only see 20% of what is going on. And therefore, there's a tendency to not notice frauds more often than not. What happens in the digital era is that not many of us are, really very well equipped in terms of technology. And given the fact that we're working in very disparate setups, it's very likely that the visible part of the iceberg is much less than 20% even, because of the new normal that we are all dealing with. And this important point is something that I wanted to really start out with. These are some of the corporates that have either been subject matter or targets of fraud in various forms, various shapes. And we've seen some of them have seen a higher level of technological use in the perpetration of fraud. So I think that's really the context of corporate India in the news, where we've seen a lot of companies having to deal with this challenge on the fly alongside running their day-to-day business. Now let's look at a concept which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but I think it's important to baseline this point before I kind of move into my technical session. And that is that when you look at fraud as such, Dr. Donald Cressy propounded this theory of the fraud triangle, where he essentially said that all three elements need to come together, which is perceived pressure, perceived opportunity, and rationalization. Perceived pressure, you will all agree that because of the pandemic and what is happening in the world around us, job losses, recession, etc., the perceived pressure is significantly higher today than it was maybe a year ago, same time, when we had just started hearing of this new concept called COVID-19 and some faraway place called Wuhan, which none of us had heard of before. But today, that reality is very different. Perceived opportunity are weak internal controls, opportunities for people to perpetrate fraud, etc., ineffective monitoring of controls, and so on. You will all agree that because of work from home, because of the fact that a lot of people are working in disparate sort of setups in their work home environment, and the normal social controls, the normal controls that exist in an office like cybersecurity and access controls and all that are not really prevalent in the home environment. And lastly is rationalization. That's really the Robin Hood principle that I like to call it, where you take from somebody, you think it's a victimless crime, you think it's okay to do it, and 80% of people in corporates or outside are sitting on the fence. There are 5% who will never perpetrate a fraud, whatever opportunity they get, and there are 5% who will perpetrate a fraud at the first available opportunity. So to them, scruples tend to kind of be very structured, right, for both extremes. But people in between are really the ones sitting on the fence. And when they jump off the fence, hopefully they jump on the right side. So I think lower the opportunity, lower the perceived pressure, things really which we can't really control much in today's time and age, the rationalization is therefore the only hope for most organizations. And it's important for us to understand what impact COVID-19 is having on the world around us, right? It's not just a health or economic crisis, it is a corruption crisis. And a lot of people are under this pressure, because of which perhaps people who were hitherto or until now not very prone to fraud, they were probably very smart, very technically savvy. They were using their intelligence and their technical knowledge to for the betterment of society, for corporates that they were working with. But now, because of job loss and recession, maybe many of them are now being prompted or now being kind of forced or pushed into perpetrating corporate fraud using digital means. If you look at Transparency International in India, I'm sure a lot of you would have seen this, but what's interesting to note, in which surprised me and intrigued me in equal proportion, is the fact that the CPI rank, or the Corruption Perception Index rank of India, has actually fallen from 76 in 2012 to 86 in 2020. And it has actually fallen 6 places, from 80 in the 2019 survey to 86 in the 2020 survey. So I think what this really tells us is that in spite of our best efforts, because of a lot of social factors and a lot of economic factors, people and communities are being pushed into higher level of corruption, bribery, fraud, and those sort of things, which are a challenge which the world is dealing with, but India is struggling because of that as well, just like the rest of the world. I will now present to you an observational video to highlight the point I want to make. And the instructions are very self-explanatory in this video, and I'll try to increase the volume. Hopefully you can hear this as well, but even if you can't, the instructions are very clearly stated on the screen. So my suggestion is to pay careful attention. So I think the point to make is, it's quite limited and quite obvious when you saw this observational video. And that is that when you're focused on your KRAs, when you're focused on your regular day-to-day work, there's a likelihood that you might miss the obvious signs. With that, I think I should talk about the profile of a fraudster. And it's very important for us to understand why profiling is really key, because there are certain categories of people, certain attributes about fraud that are uniform. And when I say uniform, they are quite universal in nature, be it India or be it Scandinavia, be it North America, South America, Africa, wherever. But there are certain characteristics that you definitely can look at. For instance, 75% or greater than that are fraudsters who are in the age group of 36 to 55. Usually, this is a point in time when people start facing pressures of demands, of expectations of debt and loans and EMIs and all of that. They also rise to a certain level in the organization of hierarchy. Greater than 80% are male. I don't know if men are more prone to fraud or otherwise, but it's also likely that a large number of senior people in many organizations, it's probably the demographic in most organizations, are men. So therefore, maybe that is what causes it. 67% are employed by the company. So they are occupational fraudsters or insiders. And when I talk about digital fraud, it's not necessarily somebody who from the outside who's coming and attacking the company. It is also a function of what people from within the organization will also be prone to doing. Greater than 68% hold either senior or middle level positions. This is not a surprise. This is what is called management override of controls, which enables people to take certain decisions or do certain things, which allow them to perpetrate fraud. And 45% or above are employed in the organization for at least 6 years, by which time they would have built a reputation for themselves. They would have known people. And fraudsters tend to be great risk managers, and they tend to be great social engineers. So let's look at these elements of behavior, right? So if you look at most fraudsters, greater than 80% are autocratic with their teams, and they're also friendly, but with the rest of the organization. So when red flags occur, people tend of gloss over it and say, you know what, maybe it's his style of working or her style of working. And, this person is an outperformer. Maybe there is no element of fraud about this. 83% are esteemed and they're well respected in their organizations, right? And, a large number of them are likely to have colluded. So, and that is a reflection of the control environment in the organization. Why do they need to collude? Because you have maker, checker, and super checker controls. And the only way to mitigate that is for the maker and the checker to collude, or the maker, checker, and super checker to collude. And very few are lone wolf sort of attacks, right? Greater than 97% are motivated by personal greed and gain. I'm yet to see a fraudster who's defrauded money or taken money from an organization and given it off to charity, right? Most people do it for their own benefit. And a significant number, greater than 75%, are discovered based on whistleblower complaints. Now, the whistleblower could either be a participant in a fraud scheme before, or could be an outsider who's just observed, right? So the idea is, how do you get a participating whistleblower to come out, potentially self-implicate themselves and file a complaint, right? So conventional controls need not always yield you the desired results. And therefore, how do you educate people in the organization? And I think most importantly, every fraudster is a high performer, and therefore everybody is blue-eyed boy or girl, and there are obvious red flags which tend to get ignored as a result. Further fallout, according to the World Economic Forum of COVID-19, among multiple factors, recession, and all that we are seeing around the world, cyber attacks and data fraud due to sustained shift in the way in which people are working. I spoke of some of that: digitization, work from home, etc. Those triggers actually cause these sort of heightened risks. And some of these we see on a daily basis. You see phishing attacks, you look at cyber stalking, malware, cyberbullying, obscenity. Sometimes people tend to reveal too much as well on Facebook or LinkedIn. So these are some of the contributory factors when people are exposing themselves to the world around them. To what extent are they opening themselves up to be targets of cyber attacks and cyber fraud? If you look at this is my favorite picture. It's talking about a forest, showing a forest fire, and which the people are trying to extinguish using a drone, right? So more often than not, that's the way cyber attacks or digital issues are dealt with by organizations. So if you look at some key trends in cyber fraud, India, for instance, has seen a 37% increase in cyber attacks in the first quarter of 2020. We also rank 27th globally. It's a 5-position jump. Unlike what we saw in the Corruption Perception Index, here we've jumped 5 positions to the 27th position globally. We also rank 11th worldwide in the number of attacks caused by servers hosted within the country, right? So these are not North Koreans and the Russians and the others. And in spite of conspiracy theorists, a large number of by people or servers which are resident in our country. If you look at the damage that cybercrime is expected to cause globally, in 2021, it is expected to hit $6 trillion. And I actually sat down to count the number of zeros. It's 12 zeros, right, after 6. And if you look at the worldwide spending on cybersecurity, that's a small fraction, right? It's just 133 odd billion dollars. It's small change compared to the extent of damage. So how prepared are we? And hackers attack every 39 seconds, on an average 2,244 times a day, right? And an average cyber fraud lasts for about 11 months. It costs about $3.92 million on an average, right? And with the extent of acceleration that we're seeing in digitization, this is only going to increase. If you look at the risk profile of a fraudster is most likely to hit a company or people where the difficulty to breach is low and the magnitude of gain is high. So the risk reward ratio is in favor of companies which have a significant amount of money to lose or a significant amount of information or IP to lose, and the presence of weak controls or weak cyber controls in place. So if you look at it, there are multiple ways in which these can happen. We talked of some malware, social engineering, insider threats, etc. These are some of the additional ones. You have phishing attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. Phishing attacks are typically emails that companies get claiming to be something or from a bank, and people click on that link and go, and there's some malware that gets installed. You have malware attacks. You have CEO fraud. I'll talk about one of those instances in my case studies later. You have invoice redirect frauds, which also I'll talk about. And in addition to which, we've all, I'm sure, heard about hacking and farming. Farming is a form of hacking, but they pretty much redirect a user to a different website. And with the level of online shopping and online buying and online everything, you see that a large number of instances of farming are now coming to play. And this is really the world that we live in. And so, you can't be either in denial about it, or none of us can really be unaware about it. So the first one that I want to talk about in terms of, it was the largest banking fraud using cyber tools that was carried out on a Bangladesh bank. This is the Bangladesh Central Bank. I'm sure some of you would have read about it or may remember. The total magnitude of this fraud was about $81 million. And the way it was perpetrated was over a short period of time, where a spear phishing message was sent to certain targeted individuals. And when they clicked on it, the computer systems are infected and compromised. And those caused the SWIFT system to be accessed. So that gave the people who were wanting to hack the Bangladesh Central Bank access to their internal systems, which allowed them to send a total of 35 SWIFT messages to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And for those of you who have knowledge about banking, a large number of countries have their funds lying with the bank in New York, the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and as did Bangladesh Bank. What happened as a consequence of these 35 SWIFT messages that were sent were that 4 messages yielded the Federal Reserve Bank of New York yielded to those 4 messages, and they transferred a total of $81 million to a bank called RCBC. It was a unknown bank until then. RCBC was a bank based in the Philippines. Now, those of you who come from the banking sector will know that there are certain countries like Lebanon and Switzerland that have very, very stringent banking privacy laws, right? So of course, that's changing because of a lot of pressure from the West, but historically, they've had very, very stringent privacy laws for banking. So a lot of people used to keep their ill-gotten gains in some of these countries. But Philippines, incidentally, and surprise, when I was researching this, Philippines is a country which has an extremely high level of banking privacy. They have a banking regulation act which prevents even regulators or legislators to access bank accounts. So whoever were the fraudsters knew about this fact, and they had created multiple accounts in this RCBC bank in a branch. And you will wonder why only 4 messages yielded money. The actual impact would have been more than $1 billion or $2 billion. Incidentally, or as luck would have it for the fraudsters, the name of the bank branch was similar to the name of an oil tanker, which was in the sanctions list or in the red flag list vis-a-vis Iran. So Iran, as we all know, is under sanction. And because of that, 31 out of those 35 messages were red flagged and they were not acted upon. And as you will know, these SWIFT messages must be coming by the hundreds of thousands on a daily basis. Not all of them have human intervention, right? So as a result of which, this money was transferred to RCBC from into multiple accounts from where it was laundered using a casino, and that money disappeared. Of which some money was recovered. It's been a few years since, but they haven't been able to recover about 67 million US dollars. That money is gone for good, right? So the point is, how in spite of all the controls, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, one imagines, is the most probably secure bank in the world. SWIFT systems are also very well tested, right? But in spite of which, through an investigation which went across multiple jurisdictions around the world, Asia, the Middle East, it went to Europe, it went to America, in spite of which a lot of the money was not recovered. Looking at the second is an investigation that we've done in the course of our work, where there was this is what an invoice redirect fraud that I talked about, or an authorized push payment fraud, as we refer to. It's an authorized push payment fraud in the sense that you get an email request from a vendor requesting a change in the bank account for payment of their invoices. Now the question you will obviously have is, how do these fraudsters know which vendor, what invoice number, what invoice value, who to write an email to? So usually this is preceded, this email message is preceded by a phishing message, which targets people in the organization. And in many cases, these attacks happen prior to which 3-4 months, there's software, malicious software code or malware sitting in the company systems, monitoring and transferring data, right? They're monitoring who's writing emails to whom, who's the person responsible for what is the tonality of the email, who addresses whom in what manner. So they're accumulating a lot of information through all of what's going on, that they see email traffic, transactions, and so on, and they are transmitting that. If the organization has good controls in place, good cyber controls in place, they will be in a good position to do that. But in this case, the organization perhaps did not have those kind of controls. And once the request for change in the vendor bank account came through, it came through in the form of an email, right? And when you looked at the email, you could very clearly see that this email had come not from a domain name similar. So for instance, it was ABC company at, somebody at abccompany.com. It had not come from abccompany.com. It had come from Gmail address. It had come from a Gmail address. There are occasions when it comes from a spoofed email ID where it is made to look or sound similar to the original company's email address. But in this case, it wasn't the case. So this email came through, the employee acted upon it, and the money was transferred. So they lost over a period of 3 or 4 instances, over a period of 5 or 6 months, they lost almost $15 million. And typically these frauds come to light only when the vendor follows up for the money. So the vendor writes after a few days or weeks and says, you know what, you've not paid me my money. And then the person says, but I've already paid you this money. Here is the proof of payment. And the vendor turns around and says, sorry, I've never sent you an email like this. Can you please share the email with me? And the vendor then notices that there is a problem. So in this case, there was another angle where there was an employee involved. We did some investigations because during the discussions, we found that the employees were giving very cagey answers, very defensive answers. When we analyzed, we found that the invoice that was sent by the fraudulent vendor through the attack on the AP staff, that invoice was created by one of the employees. When we looked at the metadata, we actually figured out which website they had gone to. The invoice was actually a PDF form invoice. It was uploaded there, changes were made, saved and downloaded, and then it was emailed 2 minutes later. So we looked at the date and time stamps and all of that. So if you look at it, this really is quite rampant. It's quite widely prevalent. And there are many instances like these that one can talk about. But I think the most important thing that you need to look at is, what are the key takeaways? How do you mitigate these issues? How do you prevent something like this from happening? Because nobody is really immune to this issue. So there are many things that can be done, but I think very important, one needs to really focus on the human firewall. And while on one hand, I'm talking about digitization and the extent and the acceleration that we see, you still have human beings coming in at certain points in time, certain manual interventions. you need to look at educating human beings. So digital fraud awareness sessions are extremely important, right, to make people aware of the kind of frauds that they're encountered in the world outside their immediate domain. What you also need to look at is in what manner are your systems vulnerable? Because if somebody is being able to send malware into your system at the drop of a hat, what sort of tech controls do you have in place? Do you have a pen test? Do you have adequate firewalls in place? Do you have sufficiently sophisticated technology? Or are you, is it like a drone trying to fight a forest fire, in the simile that I offered a little while ago? So I think overall, it's something that we all need to be aware of. And I don't think I can cover more in the time that I have. And it's a very, very wide topic. More than happy to, take off separate offline sessions with whoever is interested. My contact details are available in the email on the last slide, as well as on the, the website of IIA. There are polls that you would have got from time to time that you can, also participate in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shashank, for an interesting session. We have some questions coming in. One is from Arundhati Das, and she has raised the question, more often than not, fraud is detected only after a whistleblower. So are there any active techniques for identifying frauds, especially when there is collusion?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And even the statistics that I presented also highlighted the fact that greater than 70% of frauds are discovered because of whistleblower. The number, if I remember correctly, was 75%. But is it a function of companies not knowing how frauds are occurring? Is it a question of awareness levels being low in organizations, or is it the philosophy to say that, okay, you know what, let's not bother what other people are doing, let's focus on what we are doing? So I think building awareness is very important. Telling people what is right or wrong is very important. And most organizations, code of conduct stay where they are. That is on the social side, that's on the softer side. On the transaction side, transaction monitoring, analyzing using data analytics, or sometimes when you might get an unusual request from somebody, people need to be more alert. And how do you educate people to deal with or to start looking suspiciously at their colleagues? I think it's not to do with suspicion, it's not to do with mistrusting, it's to do with a certain level of skepticism, because that is the reality of the world we live in, right? So I think it's just a matter of using a combination of factors: awareness, professional skepticism in people, and leveraging technology by using data analytics tools. And of course, artificial intelligence and all of that, based on how you can draw patterns.
Sure.
Percy, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question. Would you mind repeating that?
Okay, so if I'm audible, the next question is from Manoj Agrawal, and Manoj is talking about what are the top 3 or 5 controls which can be implemented and reduce the fraud.
Right. So that's a very wide sort of question, and I think I will respond by saying that if I'm looking at digital fraud, and some of it could be something that organizations already do, but one is to say that what is the organization's awareness of the different frauds that it is faced with, and if you look at any sort of controls in an organization, are they geared to deal with the risk of fraud? Right. So if you look at procurement, if you look at sales and distribution, if you look at any process across the organization, let's take payments as a case in point, right? To what extent are your enterprise controls geared to deal with the risk of fraud.
Hello.
If let's say there are, hi, am I audible? Welcome back, Percy.
Yeah.
So I think I got the next question. So I was just beginning to respond to it.
Okay.
So the point is, once you know what sort of frauds exist, those can then be, you can implement those controls vis-a-vis that. So for instance, let me take payment as a case in point. If I look at payment and an organization has online payment happening, now the file that they generate through SAP for, let's say, payment which needs to be uploaded into the internet banking site of the bank, what sort of controls exist on that file, right? Is it an encrypted file? Is it a file which is easy for a person to edit? Or is it just a plain Excel spreadsheet which anybody can put in additional line items of payee names and upload it on the website? And it can be discovered much later, because the data that comes back from the bank comes in the form of a flat file, for instance. The payment data which the bank sends back comes in the form of a flat file. I can edit that flat file and upload it into SAP, for instance, right? It's possible. We've actually done the pen test to actually test this particular thing, whether it operates. So it's different for different organizations. The only important thing that you need to do is to simulate. You need to actually put yourself in the shoes of a fraudster and say, what are those controls? How will I, if I were to perpetrate a fraud, how will I go about doing it? Now, some of it is easy to answer, some of it is not, because if you knew about it, you would probably already have taken care of it. If you don't know, it's the unknown. So, probably get experts like us in, and then try and figure out a way in which those controls can be implemented.
Yeah, thanks, Shashank. We have also one question coming in from Vijay Raghavan, and he has asked, of late, there have been some cyber attacks and hacks through third-party vendors and solutions. What are some of the key best practices in this area?
So I think third-party sites, if I hear you correctly, your question, you're asking me about people that are part of my process, but which are not, within my organization. They could be my vendors, they could be my customers, they could be people who, or my bank, for instance, who could be a target of fraud. The same logic the same philosophy that I talked about. One is to ensure that, people who are dealing with sensitive information, who are in key positions of making payments, of doing transactions which can potentially lead to damage to the organization, they are made aware of the risk of what they're handling, of the risk of fraud. B, basic anti-phishing, because the way somebody can enter your organization digitally is through sending an email with a malware, or sending a phishing request, an email request where people click on it. Have adequate controls in place in your firewalls to ensure that such emails are filtered and are pushed out. They're put in junk folders. So I'm sure some organizations have that. Third is, you need to have adequate data leakage protocols in place. In many organizations, DLPs still don't operate. They either don't operate or they don't operate effectively. One is not saying that we need to straitjacket people and disable pen drive access or hard disk access and things like that. But if it's a matter of stealing digital data, or if accessing digital data, ensure that you have adequate controls in place, so that if somebody is trying to steal something from within your organization, you have those mitigations in place where it can be discovered. For instance, encrypting pen drives which are put into your computers. You should not be able to allow any pen drive to access data from your enterprise computers. A fourth could be, have adequate intrusion alerts, right? In your so if something does come in, and if it's residing, I gave the example of a malware which serves like a Trojan. It sits there just observing, not acting. You need to have sufficient enterprise controls in place to ensure that such things are diagnosed in time. So for instance, if you have a virus in the body automatically reacts in a certain way, right? It reacts because a virus cannot sit in your body without a reaction. There will be fever, there'll be body ache, etc. So how does your organization react to something entering your body or your organization? That is something that you need to prep your organization for through simulation. So just like the vaccine that a lot of us may have taken, just like that, you need to simulate an attack on your organization and see what your organization does as a response to it. Is it prepared? Is it ready? Your readiness needs to be checked. And finally, like I mentioned, the human firewall. Human beings need to be trained. They need to be, and this is not just people in key positions, because if I'm a social engineer, I will use somebody else who's not in a key position to influence that person to do something, like the CEO fraud, where the CEO writes an email purportedly to a person who's holding a key position, and that person acts in a certain manner. So I think it's a combination of things that can be done.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shashank. We also have one more question, which says that there are generally overriding of controls is the main reason for a fraud. So can we prevent such overriding or collusion, which may be hypothetically complete to even ask for? Is this possible from your experience? That's what Lokesh is asking.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. So like I gave the example of something that you don't know, and if you don't know something is an enemy, you will not have the ability to deal with it. You'll not have the ability to attack it. And if you look at, I'm sure all of us have experienced antivirus software, right? So if you look at antivirus software, sometimes it will tell you that some file is behaving like a virus, right? It does not identify it as a known virus, but it says certain file has malicious code which sounds and is behaving like a virus. So I think as long as your organization has the relevant alerting mechanisms, for instance, let me take a simple example of change in the vendor bank account, right? If there's a change in the vendor bank account by the person who may be quite junior in the hierarchy, is it something that triggers an alert, right? Or if I'm changing the flat file, I gave the example earlier. Let me extend that example. If I change the flat file and I delete a line item, or I while uploading the data from Excel into the bank's portal for payment of a certain file of a certain set of vendors, if I add another vendor line item, and once I upload that data into SAP, does it trigger any sort of alert mechanism, right? Let's look at something that we understand, an ERP system. We may not understand firewalls and intrusion alerts at that level, but what sort of triggering mechanism is there in the organization? Has somebody thought about it? Are those rules built in? Is there an anti-fraud system sitting atop your ERP system where rules are written, which can send those alerts? But unless and until you know what those issues are and have those controls built in, you will never know, right? Till it's very late.
Thank you. So your session was so interesting that we keep getting more and more questions from the participants. One more question which has come in is it advisable to scan network devices without any authentication? So this is
Okay.
yeah.
So if you're asking me if devices which have not been authenticated, which means external devices which are not part of your organization. So I think a lot of organizations have BYOD policies, bring your own device policies, and people, employees are allowed to connect to the enterprise network. And now with this work from home, it could be a case where new onboarded employees potentially are connecting to the enterprise servers and networks using their own computers. But having said that, I think the organization needs to take due care to ensure that those BYODs are adequately vetted. They have the enterprise policies, and they are put through the technology controls that exist. It's not easy. Not all organizations know what needs to be done. Not all organizations are geared. People take greater money, therefore are focused more on the business side of it. But I think if your question relates to BYOD, I think those vettings need to happen. If your question relates to whether an external computer, if my own enterprise systems can be scanned without authentication, I'm not sure if there's any organization, unless it's a very small company, which would have no server, which would have no antivirus or firewall and so on. But I think most organizations that I know of would definitely have basic controls in place.
Thank you. And we take one more last question. The present work from home situation has increased the risk of dummy employees and or employees working in multiple companies simultaneously. So what could be the additional controls in this area, if you may?
Right. So I think that's also a very important question to answer. So a lot of companies these days have login requirements. They have login requirements where an employee needs to stay logged in into a particular system, where let's say 9:30 in the morning, the employee logs into the system and is online until 6 or 6:30, and they also monitor the activity of what is going on in on the company, the employee's computer, company given computer. So there are tools and technologies that are available. It is not to say that you should not trust your employees. I'm, a huge fan of trusting employees and trusting people in general. But I think given the situation, one needs to obviously change oneself, right? For instance, I know of a lot of online exams as well, where these days students in schools and colleges, one is the online computer screen that they're sitting before, but they're also required to maintain another camera which is pointed at them, right, when they're taking the exam. I'm not saying go to that extreme, but there are multiple ways in which this can be monitored, right? So there are tools available in the market, and I'm happy to kind of talk to the person who asked this question offline and help point in the direction of some of them. But I think one must change with the times. One must alter one's behavior. But from what I hear people complaining about is to say that since work from home, they've been working longer hours and a lot more. So I don't know how people are able to do two jobs in the 8 or 10 hours that they have, honestly.
True that, Shashank. So thank you very much for your thoughts. We will take some of the questions offline because we
Sure.
don't have we do not have that much of time. So thank you, Shashank, for your thoughts on future of fraud in a digital economy, especially the example which you shared about the Bangladesh bank heist, the $81 million fraud and how it got uncovered. So it was really very insightful. And we would now close this session, and participants need to again log in into the next session at the given time. Thank you very much, Shashank, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, Percy. Thanks, everybody, for your wonderful questions. It was great interacting with you. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you.